He is lying on bare earth, and he has asked for it himself. Around him the friars kneel in silence, the lamps low, the autumn air carrying the smell of damp soil through the open door of the Portiuncula Chapel. It is October 1226, and the man who once gave away his father's entire fortune in the middle of a public square is now giving away the last thing he has, the breath in his lungs. Francis of Assisi is 44 years old, nearly blind, his hands and feet carrying wounds that have not closed in 2 years. If you have been searching for something that the wider world no longer talks about openly, stay with this. And if what you find tonight matters to you, a quiet like or subscribe costs nothing and helps more people find their way here. His brothers lean close. Some of them are weeping. Francis asks them to sing. Even now, even at the very edge of everything, he wants the canticle, his great hymn of praise to Brother Sun and Sister Moon and Sister Death herself, who, he wrote, no living man can escape, yet who, for those who die in God's most holy will, cannot truly harm. This is the Francis the Church canonized in 1228, less than 2 years after his death. This is the documented man of history, born in Assisi around 1181 or 1182, son of a prosperous cloth merchant, a young man who dreamed of knighthood and glory before a strange illness and a period of imprisonment broke something loose in him that the world could not put back. He heard a voice in a crumbling chapel at San Damiano, "Repair my house, which is falling into ruin." He took it literally at first, carrying stones with his own hands. It took a little time before he understood the house was larger than any single building in Umbria. What he built in its place: the Order of Friars Minor, the Franciscans, the brotherhood of radical poverty and itinerant preaching, spread through Europe within his own lifetime with a speed that astonished even those who lived through it. By 1221 there were more than 5,000 brothers. They were not monks cloistered behind walls. They walked the roads. They preached in...
For 400 years they kept this sealed. We gathered every prophecy they tried to bury into one book, written plainly, nothing hidden, nothing softened. If you want the whole truth, not the version they approved, it's pinned in the top comment. Get it tonight.
Market squares. They sat with lepers when no one else would come near. Francis himself journeyed to Egypt in 1219, crossing enemy lines during the Fifth Crusade to speak personally with Sultan al-Kamil, a meeting that shocked the Crusaders and fascinated the Sultan, who reportedly listened to Francis for days and sent him back unharmed. He received the stigmata on a mountain called Laverna in September 1224, while fasting in preparation for the Feast of the Holy Cross. Thomas of Celano, his earliest biographer, recorded the eyewitness accounts. The wounds of Christ appeared in Francis's hands, feet, and side. They did not heal. For the remaining 2 years of his life, he lived with them, quietly, trying to keep them covered. The pain, by all accounts, was constant. The joy, by all accounts, was also constant. This is the Francis the Church knows and venerates. A man who stood inside a system he loved even as he felt its weight bending good men down. A man who never broke from Rome and never asked anyone else to break from it, yet who knew, because poverty and the open road teach things that comfort cannot, that the Church as a human institution was capable of being wounded from within just as surely as it could be threatened from without. And then there is the other text. It has traveled down through the centuries in a different kind of vessel. Not in the great Franciscan chronicles, not in the earliest lives of the saint compiled by Thomas of Celano or Bonaventure. What is claimed in this text is that in his final days, Francis gathered his brothers close and spoke to them not only of comfort, but of warning, a warning about what would come to the Church long after he was gone. The text as it comes down to us in later printed collections, most prominently in a volume called Works of the Seraphic Father St. Francis of Assisi, published in London by Washburn in 1882, reads something like this. The passage attributed to Francis begins, "Act bravely, my brethren, take courage and trust in the Lord. The time is fast approaching, in which there will be great trials and afflictions. Perplexities and dissensions, both spiritual and temporal, will abound. The charity of many will grow cold, and the malice of the wicked will increase." It continues, and here is the passage that has made scholars and faithful alike sit up straight for generations. At the time of this tribulation, a man, not...
If your heart is heavy, that feeling is a grace. but don't stop at fear. We wrote the prayers to answer it. The rosary, the consecration, the protection for you and the ones you love. Don't face what's coming unprepared. It's pinned in the top comment. Get it tonight.
Canonically elected, will be raised to the pontificate, who, by his cunning, will endeavor to draw many into error and death. He who at that time will have kept the faith and proved himself zealous for God and his honor will have a hard time, and those who will preserve their faith intact there will be very few. The text then speaks of a shepherd who is not a true pastor, but a destroyer. Those words have circulated, been quoted in Catholic circles, been pointed at this pope, or that schism, or this crisis, or that one. For well over a century, they have been applied to the Western Schism, to the Reformation, to the Second Vatican Council, to virtually every rupture in Catholic life that has produced deep disagreement among the faithful. Before going further, honesty demands a pause here. Scholars who have examined this text closely, including researcher Solanus Benfati, who analyzed what he termed the paternity of this medieval report, have concluded that the attribution to Francis is, at best, dubious. There is no contemporary 13th century manuscript. The text shares very little in style or theological vocabulary with writings that can be securely traced to Francis himself. It appears to reflect concerns and language more characteristic of a later period, possibly the century after Francis's death, a time of intense conflict within the Franciscan order over the question of poverty and papal authority, a dispute that became extraordinarily bitter and that did in fact produce men who questioned the canonical legitimacy of certain papal decisions. In other words, it is possible, perhaps even likely, that this prophecy was not spoken by the dying Francis at all. It may have been composed by someone who loved Francis, who drew on his name and authority to give weight to a warning they believed needed to be heard in their own turbulent time. That is not an unusual thing in medieval religious literature. It was not always understood as forgery. It was sometimes understood as channeling the spirit of a great teacher, of saying what he would have said, of placing words in his mouth that his followers believed were true to his vision. That context matters. And yet, and this is the thing that makes the text remarkable, regardless of its origins, the vision it describes, whether or not it came from Francis's lips on his deathbed at the Portiuncula, reflects something that is not invented. The Church has known disputed papal elections. It has known moments when the question of who legitimately held the Petrine office was not a question with a simple answer. The Western Schism from 1378 to 1417 produced precisely this situation. Multiple men simultaneously claiming to be the valid successor of Peter, with different factions of Christendom, entire kingdoms, entire national churches, aligning behind different claimants, and sincere, learned, devout Catholics on every side. If a medieval Franciscan composed this text in the shadow of such a schism, he was not inventing a crisis. He was describing one he had lived through or could see approaching. And he reached for the name of Francis to give the warning the weight it needed to be heard. What reaches us now, in this strange late hour of Western Christianity, is not simply a text. It is a question that the text carries inside itself, the way a letter carries something heavier than its words. The question is this: how does a faithful person discern in a moment of genuine institutional confusion who speaks with legitimate authority and who does not? Francis himself answered this question with his life, and the answer he gave was not a simple one. He submitted to Rome. He changed his rule when Rome asked him to, though it cost him. He watched men he loved leave his order over disagreements about what poverty truly meant, and he did not follow them into schism even when they had arguments he could not easily refute. He trusted the structure even as he pressed against it from inside with every ounce of his joy and his poverty and his wounded hands. And yet he also knew, and this is the Francis who preached to the birds when men would not listen, the Francis who spoke to the Sultan when crusaders told him he was wasting his time. He also knew that fidelity to the Church is not the same as silence in the face of what is wrong. He had rebuilt a crumbling chapel with his own hands before he understood the metaphor. He was not a man who looked at ruins and called them sound. There is a generation of Catholics today, many of them older, many of them formed in a tradition that is not primarily textbook or academic, but devotional, passed from grandmother to grandchild, carried in rosaries and novenas, and the smell of incense on a Sunday morning, for whom the text attributed to Francis does not require a certificate of authenticity to raise serious and legitimate questions. They have watched fractures widen inside the institution they love. They have watched the language of pastoral care used to justify positions that contradict what they were taught, by teachers they trusted, at the knees of people who are now gone. They look at the text, whether Francis said it or not, and they feel it describes something real, not a prediction that has been fulfilled in some dramatic and datable way, not a prophecy whose hour has struck and can be named, but a pattern, a recurring shape in church history, a thing that can happen, has happened, and, if the faithful are not paying attention, can happen again. That feeling deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. The man lying on the floor of the Portiuncula on October 3, 1226, dying in the dark with his brothers around him, was not a man who made things easy. He did not simplify the question of how to be faithful in an institution that is simultaneously holy and human, divinely protected and historically fallible. He lived inside that tension until the last breath. He asked his brothers to sing, and then he died. He left behind something that millions of people have tried to follow for 8 centuries. A rule, a way of poverty, a canticle, and whether or not he spoke them, words that have been attributed to him and that will not stop circulating. Words that say, keep the faith, trust in the Lord, and be very careful whom you follow when the hour of confusion comes. Pope Leo XIV, elected in May 2025, is the first pope to take the name Leo in over a century, a detail that has not gone unnoticed by those who follow prophetic traditions in the Church. Whether that detail has any bearing on the attributed words of Francis is a matter of genuine speculation, not established teaching, and any honest commentary has to say so plainly. No one can responsibly set a date, name a fulfillment, or declare with certainty that a prophecy whose origins are disputed has now come to pass. That is not the work of faith. It is the work of projection. What faith can do, what Francis himself modeled, is hold the question open, trust God, pay attention, keep the charity that, the attributed text warns, grows cold in the time of tribulation. Stay close to the sacraments, stay close to the poor. Do not be dazzled by cunning or by claims that require you to abandon the plain testimony of your conscience. The text attributed to Francis ends with a call to courage. Act bravely, my brethren. Whether Francis spoke those words or not, they are true. Whether the man lying on the earth at the Portiuncula foresaw exactly what the text describes, or whether someone who loved him composed those words in a later darkness, the call they carry belongs to every age of the Church that has ever found itself unsure of where the solid ground is. The wounds in Francis's hands were real. The poverty was real. The joy was real. The Church he loved and worried about was real. And the question, how does a faithful person hold on when the hour of confusion is upon them, is a question that does not grow old, does not go away, and does not wait for a manuscript to be authenticated before it demands an answer. It demands one now, as it always has. As it did when the friars knelt in the autumn dark at the Portiuncula, listening to their father breathe his last, and then listening to the silence, and then, because he had asked them to, beginning to sing.